I'm from the Open University. I work in the Institute of Educational Technology there. Sorry, probably if I sit down that'll be easier. And I am, oh, thank you. Thank you, Simon. And I was fairly confident I wasn't going to run out of sweets at this session. And I don't work for Allnet, which makes me quite an oddity here, although I do work with them. They're very nice people. The work on which I'm sort of talking was based around a job that I did during the first year of development of a national support centre in open resources in education, for which I acted as academic director for nearly a year. And it's based on the UK experience. Are we getting there? Yeah?
Yeah, is this one?
No, it's, is it
This one.
that one? Is it that one? No, that's Japan. Or get me in a minute. No, that doesn't look like me. Oh, it's that one, the revised. Sorry. Sorry, I could do somebody else's show. Let's go down there. Yay, thank you very much. Right, it's been a long day. Right, okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context of the UK OER programme. Can I ask who in this room, show of hands, has heard of the UK OER programme? So it's quite a few of you. Right, okay, so I'll keep it short. You can probably find out everything you wish to know about the UK OER programme at that URL. It's based in the UK, and it's quite interesting because it was 29 projects in the first year, but a lot of them had multiple partners. I think MedDev had 18 institutional partners. So in fact, there are over 80 institutions, over 80 higher education institutions in the UK involved in one or other of these projects. And the projects were funded at the institutional level, at the individual level, so individuals who wanted to do OER activity on a sort of pilot basis, and also, actually, hang on, hello, something very strange has happened. It sort of grew and then it's disappeared a bit. Let's try it again. Right, okay. Just shout if it does anything. Oh, right, okay. Strange again. Right, okay. That's all right. Fine. I didn't touch it, honestly. I'm having that kind of day. Anyway, what's, I think, very impressive if you've been reading about the UK higher education financing climate is that there has been more than £4 million put aside, found, for taking forward the first year projects, which were sort of 2009 to 10 into 2010 and 11, and some of the people in this room are involved in those projects. So that's just started, but at the stage at which we did the sort of, I suppose, the talking that fed into this manifesto that we started to draft, and which I'm very happy for other people to contribute to this because I'm very aware it's just one view at one point in time. It was in May, which was about the time of the political election in the UK. We had no idea how much upheaval that was going to cause at the time. So we felt very mindful about writing manifesto. It's based on the first year project experiences. So a lot of activity, a lot of experience in the room at the time. Right, okay. So I'm just going to point out here some of the points that were made about sustainability in terms of the funding documentation around about phase one. I think it's quite interesting that phase one of the activity was originally called the pilot stage, and then it sort of became phase one. So you might actually ask yourself whether it's really quite strict in terms of asking for sustainability if it's a pilot phase. So I think that the rules did slightly change and become somewhat tougher for the projects as we went along. But there was an assumption that people were going to adopt appropriate business methods, that they were going to make open resources available, and that they were going to be very sustainable, that they were going to have sustainability in mind at the beginning, although those projects going in originally thought that they were pilot projects and they thought there'd be other phases to bid for. Right. Well, yes, there's been a bit of relabelling going on. Right, okay. Then in the second phase, sustainability, I didn't check how many times sustainability occurred, but it occurred a lot of times. Now, I mean, sustainability, we all have probably different views about what sustainability is, and I've been trying to collect some ideas by pointing flip cameras at people and asking them this question. But funders, I think, have particular views about sustainability. And in terms of sustainability and funding, a programme like this wants to show that what it's done has been successful and that it's contributing to sustainability. So there's a sense in which it wants to build upon previous practice, which might be open to questions sometimes. But it's assessing sustainable practice, and I think it's not unusual in any funders in this respect. One of the things it's doing that I think is very interesting and helpful is trying to cascade practice, trying to fund projects that are experienced, particularly to work with less experienced HEIs specifically. So there's quite a lot of interesting things happening. And another thing that's interesting that's happening, I should say that this funding has come from JISC, which is a very educational technologist-led organisation, and the Higher Education Academy is also partners in this, and the Higher Education Academy accredits teachers, and is making some money available to do work specifically about putting open educational resource and open educational resource practice into the minds of new teachers as part of the accredited programmes that teachers induction in the UK go through. So that was phase 2. So, I mean, I think the funder's perspective, and JISC is no different than other funders in this respect. It has to prove that the money's gone somewhere useful. And they want to see the money they've put in as starting off a journey that's going to continue after the money is no longer available. I sort of adopted the panda when we did our sort of session in Leeds as a symbol maybe of a kind of not terribly sustainable project. And I was interested in the way that this conference is called Impact and Sustainability. I feel that you can have impact without sustainability. You can have sustainability without impact. You can make more pandas, and that has some impact on the population. It's not a very sustainable solution unless you do something to the environment that pandas inhabit. They can't actually keep it up themselves when you take the funding away. And I think that's something to sort of think about. And Eric Duval was talking this morning about taking risks. And that's maybe how you get impact. It's maybe not how you get sustainability. And I think we need probably both of them. That is my impression. Right, Struth, I seem to have lost a slide. Let's not worry about this too much. Right, okay. I mean, there's, in my paper, I've said that there are lots of different perspectives on what actually contributes to sustainability. So if you were to ask a librarian or an informal learner, they would have different views about what they wanted in terms of sustainability and open educational resources. Where you get a bit of quite interesting variation, you might think that all institutions or all institutional managers have a similar view, but within the institution within which I work, which is the Open University, that has quite a lot of activity around open educational resources. I suppose you'd think of it as quite mature in its sort of practice around open educational resources. So we have a sort of a showcase element. So we have the learning space, which is what most people think of when they think of Open Learn. So this is a way of displaying course complete things so that you can study them as learners, or you could use them to direct your students to study. But we also have a sort of developmental space, what we call lab space, which is a place where you can go and play on tools and you can take things and reversion and remix them. And that's a different sort of initiative, and maybe that's a really quite interesting thing if we're talking about sustaining open educational resources, because I think you can get inspired and you can use in your teaching stuff from the showcase, but you can actually go into something like Lab Space, which is our Moodle space, and you can put up your own core space and you can play around with other people's materials and you can share some of the knowledge about how you actually do the stuff. So I think we have sort of two different types of views, and obviously our views about what's sustainable. The managers in charge of each of them would have different views about what creates sustainability. So the S word. Any idea about the Creative Commons aspect of this picture? Because somebody's taken a photograph on the street, presumably, of a poster and released it under Creative Commons. I mean, I think we have to be realistic that there still are risks. You can find things under Creative Commons licenses that may be a little bit dubious in terms of using them. So I'd opened up the discussion. I mean, basically we could consider all sorts of different agendas around sustainability. But we can also sort of bring it back again to sustainability. Sustainability often, I come across sustainability as a sort of defined as self-sufficiency. And particularly when you're looking at the funder's view, there's an idea, we gave you the money and we want you to be able to stand on your own 2 feet by the end of the 12 months, by the end of the 3 years, by the end of the 5 years. And that's what they're looking for, because they're looking for a route to not have to pay you more money. I don't think that's always a really good definition of sustainability. And that's not always what we can deliver, certainly in 12 months. And I think also when we're talking about sustainability, we're not always clear about whether we're talking about the supply of open educational resources or the use and demand for open educational resources. And as I've said before, we're not always sure whose perspective on sustainability we're actually looking at. Often it's the funders who may be dominating opinion at the seeding stage, but I think other opinions come into bear in terms of continued use of it. People want, for instance, persistence in a repository if they're going to continue to invest in it and use it, and I think that's a very reasonable expectation. Right, okay. I sort of thought of funding as perhaps fighting sustainability, and I was looking for an image of fighting with Barcelona, and this is an image from a cathedral in Barcelona, whose name I have temporarily forgotten. The Cathedral of the Holy Cross, apparently, according. There may be no Cathedral of the Holy Cross. That may be a poor translation. Anyway, this was a very nice image, I thought. I think there's particular issues if your OER activity is being underwritten by short-term funding. The sort of short-term fixed nature of the funding can be a problem, but also the constraints and conditions, because funders are wanting to see results within a certain time. One of the things that happened within the UK OER in the first tranche of funding was that there was a requirement so as to avoid reinvention of the wheel, so to avoid people rushing out, taking money and making resources from scratch. There was a sort of basically a prescription against having new content, so you had to reuse content. So this meant that the content was obviously educationally useful, or very often educationally useful and educationally proven, but it was probably very risk averse and perhaps quite historic content for some projects, because they knew that that's what they could get their hands on, they knew that that's what they could turn. And there was a requirement to produce a certain number of hours of content as part of the funding project. So that took up some time and may not have been perhaps the best learning activity for the projects, but they had to spend some of their time and resource doing it because this was a requirement of the funding. So that was one of the targets that they had to meet. And I think there's also a difficulty for all of us when we're getting together projects in availability of the kind of staff that we need to put into the project. And there's a tendency maybe for staff to be project staff who go from project to project, and then they may be quite separated from the life of the institution as a whole. So that's not necessarily useful. I mean, I think the institutional projects, and Simon here's from Leeds Met, they had a particular advantage in a way, and they had quite a constraining brief, which was to embed practice. But it meant that they were very much working with the people they already had within the institution, very much so. I think the subject communities had the biggest problem because they had the biggest groups to bring together. And that was a huge challenge just to get to that first sort of starting stage of deciding how you were going to play together, really. So there's all these sort of tensions that aren't to do with OER sustainability, that are to do with the problems of it being a project. And I may be banging on about that too much. We had an event in Leeds, and we called it sort of Towards the Leeds Manifesto, and we came up with 12 what I thought were really, really good points as a result of pooling the experiences of the people in the room. And there were about 6 projects represented in the room, but there were another 5 institutions that were interested in OER or involved in OER in some way. And there were some people who were involved in supporting OER activity like CETIS and Joram. So it's quite an informed audience. One of the things, unsurprisingly, was that sustaining OER takes time and effort. It's not an overnight activity. And really a great deal of time and effort. And that one of the things that we felt was most helpful in getting the message across about OER was to have lots of examples that were relevant to staff's practice so that you could show people how OER could help them, the sort of demonstration. And there were lots of accounts of sort of eureka moments where you showed a member of staff who'd previously been totally uninterested in sharing their stuff or sharing anybody else's stuff, what stuff was actually out there within their own context, within their own discipline area. And that obviously takes time and resource as well. OER as part of staff induction, catch them when they're fresh. There was a realisation that not all staff are going to be happy with OER or ever going to take to it. There perhaps is a perception that the academic who already has a filing drawer or virtual filing cabinet full of resources that they're used to teaching with and that they're comfortable teaching with is not going to rush to embrace OER in the same way that somebody who's new to teaching a course or new to teaching might. Or maybe new to teaching online. I think we need to encourage sharing and challenge make it yourself practice where we see it, and find examples of value added. There was a feeling that in order to sell the practice of OER within your institutions, we could really do with research into what adds value, research that shows that it adds value in terms of more effective student learning, or in terms of efficiency, or in terms of developing staff, or bringing about change. There's all sorts of ways that theoretically we know that open educational resources can have institutional benefits. We don't have very much in the way of evidence to back this up at the moment. We felt that we wanted OER tools that required minimal effort. This isn't always the case, and there was almost no discussion about this because we all just thought it was self-evident. What's true, anyway? Let's go back. For the next 6, quite quickly. We're lucky in the UK, in we have some champions like the head of JISC and the head of HEFCI, our funding council, who think that OER is a very good idea. We'd like them to continue to do this and continue to go out and say it. Some of the projects did things like got their VC to do a podcast right at the start of their projects to say that he thought it was a good idea and he was going to put OER out there himself, which really did help address concerns amongst staff as to whether it was worth spending your energy on what might seem to them to be a novelty. Rewards for open behaviour. That often comes up as a reason because research, excellence in research is very clearly rewarded within the UK institutional system, but excellence in teaching isn't often rewarded. And there are moves afoot within Leeds Met University, which Simon works for. There has been some work around putting policy in place, which I believe is going in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
I'm talking about it tomorrow.
He's talking about it tomorrow. Right, okay. Okay, go to his talk, you'll find out more. But there's the idea of building it into performance, building it into the criteria for national teaching fellowship, for instance, or for teaching fellowship, for accreditation teaching fellowship, are moving on. And I think this will be really, really helpful. You don't have to do it, but it's just recognised as out there as an example. MedDev, which is this project that Suzanne's on, we're talking about not being afraid to do stuff because you're afraid of what you might find, particularly copyright nasties that you might find under stones. They're still under the stone, even if you don't turn up the stone and have a look at them. I think for me, the one that's most precious is to share even dirty resources, to share often, rather than wait until it's finalised and finished. There's a lot to be said about sharing things while you're doing them. I think we need to recognise that there are risks and identify them and prepare for less experienced, less well-resourced OER creators who are going to come up after us. I think we can look through the window at a sort of restaurant kitchen and see the expert sort of cooking that goes on, and we can even eat the product of the cooking. We don't necessarily know how to cook it as a result of what we're seeing in there. And I think that that's the issue. Lots of projects know how to do OER. How are we going to translate that into the audience who might want to cook the product at home? And it won't taste the same and it won't be exactly the same, but how do we sort of move that on? This is a picture from the rainforest, and those of you who've played hooky from this conference at some stage will probably recognise it. When we talk about ecologies, we need lots of different views about sustainability, and we need to satisfy all of them because we're all working together on this. There's one really final slide. John, I've put him as Robert Robinson. He's John Robertson of CETIS, is somebody who's been talking about information ecologies for some time and repository ecologies and the type of influence that different things within the ecology can have on each other. He's pointed out that you don't want a monoculture, something that's all about one type of thing. And you also don't perhaps, I struggle with this word, eutrophication, sort of like the kind of nitrates in the soil enriching things to the extent that it actually oversets the natural ecosystem. I think we need a balance in terms of what we're providing. Too much support can actually, I think, create fake activity, which isn't that helpful and isn't sustainable. But we want diversity. So this is a picture of Barcelona Airport. So thank you for listening. Have you got any questions? And these are the projects that were involved in the discussion. Right. Or maybe no.
You were asked about the question of like Superman or Supergirl.
Superman. I think his chest was Superman. Yeah.
But it just seems to me that, especially in the creative commons, that if somebody says, hey, look, you have my image or whatever, you can take it down, like DCMA kind of a framework. And in other words, it seems to me that there's like we're talking about fears or like it seems to me like the copyright concern is really salient, and it doesn't really have to be so much.
I don't think it should necessarily stop us doing things. I think it is about risk management and being aware of the risks. Within the UK, we've had some really good advice from people like Charles Oppenheim about copyright. And it's really about risk management. It's about being aware that, you know, if you put something up, you may need a robust and pretty thorough takedown policy. So if somebody says this image shouldn't have been there.
I mean, as soon as you get something like that, you take it down, then look into it.
Yeah.
It would just seem that that would be a less expensive approach than, like earlier today, there was a panel here, and the least expensive seems to take that heuristic.
Right.
And the cost per course was substantially lower than that.
Oh, yeah.
There are risks to having copyrighted material incorporated into the
Affirm.
And so, you know, what we should all be doing is discouraging people from putting. Fine to use things in lectures, but if you're going to put something into a video, share it with students. Because if you put it in there or under the illusion that it's okay, it's possibly protected, they're going to do it anyway. We know that they're going to do it anyway. And there is software out there that can go out and do picture recognition, stuff that's been nicked from textbooks, for example. And we do, and none of
But there's greater I think there's a lot more awareness. This is something that all of the institutions that were involved in these projects were conscious of. There's a lot more awareness of copyright and licensing and the rights and wrongs. And this is where the not looking under stones comes in. I mean, a classic is that you ask somebody if you can use their materials. You see their materials in use in a classroom and they're good and you want to put them into your repository or you want to reuse them in some way and they're nervous about it. Sometimes it's quality, sometimes they're concerned that what they're happy to share with the students they may not be happy to share sort of more broadly. But sometimes it's just a niggling doubt about copyright. They just don't want to have to look there. And I think what we're trying to show is that you just have to face the risk, and if there's something there you can replace it, you can substitute it, you can find ways around it, but to use that as a reason to not share, it's really sad, because it's still a barrier to you reusing it more locally. You're just ignoring it.
Or the fear.
It's like not opening the bank statement, really. So, yeah. No? Okay. Go to Simon's talk.